The program you are about to watch is a studio discussion between three academics discussing the current world crisis, or perhaps more precisely, the current crisis in international relations, in the global system of international relations, which threatens a major rupture and which might potentially lead to something which many are describing as a new Cold War, and which some fear might actually become something even worse than a Cold War. That we are living through a time of crisis, I think, is about the one thing that most people who follow international relations would generally agree about. So this, by definition, is an essential topic for discussion. And the three academics who are discussing this topic in this program, which you're going to be seeing, are three academics who are exceptionally well equipped to discuss this topic, this topic of the world crisis. Two of these academics have appeared on many programs which we've done on the Duran. One, of course, is Glenn Diesen, with whom I, professor at the University of Oslo, with whom I regularly co-host programs interviewing all sorts of people, diplomats, economists, military officers, former intelligence officers, diplomats, all sorts of people, which we regularly publish on the Duran. The other, Geoff Roberts, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Cork, in my opinion, the outstanding historian on the period of Joseph Stalin and on Joseph Stalin's personality and his history, somebody who's able to, therefore, to provide us an outstanding understanding of the context, the historical context into which many of these current problems fit. And the third, perhaps less well known to viewers of the Duran, but increasingly well known to me, I've been reading with immense respect and admiration various articles which I see that he has written, places like the National Interest in the United States and elsewhere. Matthew Blackburn, who is a senior researcher at NUPI, which is the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and who has a particular specialty in Russian and Eurasian studies. So, three incredibly gifted, extremely experienced, insightful academics undertaking an important, in my opinion, extremely necessary discussion on the current situation in the world. Now, this particular discussion has taken the format that it has as a result of various complex events which Matthew Blackburn, who is hosting the discussion, will describe at the very start of the program. All I would say is that the difficulty that has arisen in conducting this discussion is, in my opinion, an extremely sad commentary on the state of the modern world, and in particular the state of public discussion in the West today. Given that it is an indisputable fact, in my opinion, that we are in a global crisis, and given how dangerous that crisis potentially is, one would have thought that a proper discussion like this one between academics, people with an immense background, knowledge and experience of these topics would be welcomed and would encounter not only no difficulties, but assistance. Well, as you will see, events have been somewhat otherwise. So I'm glad to say that we've decided at the Duran to step in and to make sure that this discussion actually gets rather more publicity and rather more attention than some people perhaps would like it to have. Now, I say that because, of course, there is a view, a current view about the causes of the global crisis that we're living through. You can read it every day in the newspapers, in all sorts of magazines. You hear various political leaders talk about it. You have it discussed in parliaments and in news programs. Briefly, it's a situation where the Western powers, having won the Cold War and established a wonderful, perfect, or near perfect system of international relations based on the new liberal rules-based order, of finding it disrupted by all sorts of malevolent actors in places like China and Russia. Well, I don't think that remotely adequately describes the problems that we are in. It's one that, in my opinion, discounts the complexity of causes and the role played in the crisis, not just by leaders in places like Russia and China, but in the West as well. Anyway, this program obviously looks into the causes more deeply. It looks at them with historical insight. It both challenges various analogies that have been put forward in discussions and descriptions of the crisis. And of course, it looks at the actions and motivations of parties on every side. It approaches this topic with the clarity and the rigor that you would expect from academics. So, without further ado, let me pass it on. Please watch this program, enjoy it, learn from it. I myself have learned a great deal, and I hope and trust and believe that you will find it extremely interesting. Thank you.
All right. My name is Matthew Blackburn. I'm a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and with me today are Professor Geoffrey Roberts, Emeritus Professor at University College Cork, and Professor Glenn Diesen, Professor at University of Southern Eastern Norway. And originally, the three of us planned to participate in an event here in Oslo, which we were going to entitle The Dangerous Interregnum, Can the Slide to Global War Be Halted? But that event has not actually place, and so we are here in a different format, but still with a chance to speak to each other in a kind of interactive discussion. And so I'm very glad that three of us are here, three academics with different backgrounds, perhaps different generations, different disciplines, and maybe making different arguments. But here we are at a time in history when the idea of interregnum resonates more. I picked up this idea in Glenn Diesen's book that came out this year called The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. It comes from Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist who contributed so much to political and social theory. To quote Gramsci, the interregnum is a kind of crisis in which, I quote, "the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear," end quote. And we all know what these morbid symptoms are, whether it's the war in Ukraine, in Gaza, whether it's the international economy, the inflation, or other kinds of symptoms that suggest the idea of a US-led order is crumbling into something else. That something else has not fully formed. Now, to say that we're in a planetary polycrisis maybe is pushing it too far, but we certainly can't dismiss out of hand the threat of a multi-theatre, multi-power war. But assuming we don't have World War III, we also have some evidence that we're sliding into a Cold War. So whether it's a hot war or a Cold War doesn't sound good. Now, just to get things started, I'll go back to a book I read last year by Gilbert Achcar, who's a Lebanese scholar, and his book was called The New Cold War, which is appropriate for this discussion. And when it came to sort of defining what is Cold War, he went back to actually Edward Bernstein, the revisionist Marxist, who brought it into modern usage to talk about Imperial German and its peacetime war spending, military spending, its peacetime alliance system, and the idea that this heavy sort of military spending was not good. It would lead to catastrophe. And these socialists advocated détente, disarmament, before the first Cold War that we all know of actually happened. Now, Ashkar points out that with the advent of atomic weapons, the Cold War takes on a new dimension. We're thinking about the logic of mutually assured destruction, and that these superpowers attempt to maintain a balance of terror, as he puts it, which means constant spending on arms race escalations. And in the kind of definition that we get from Ashkar, this is a kind of constant peacetime military spending, a failure to achieve overarching diplomatic solution to reduce tensions or dismantle hostile alliance systems. Now, of course, we all, I am from the generation that came of age when the Cold War ended and when this was dismantled for 4 decades of the last Cold War. And, it did appear to certainly my parents' generation somewhat absurd or laughable that we would go back to having another Cold War so quickly. We would be remilitarizing Europe, and we would be back staring down the abyss, going toe-to-toe with the Russians. But here we are, and if I had to summarize from my own perspective and my own reading and analysis of how the Western commentariat kind of analyzes the situation, there is this kind of sentiment that we won the last Cold War, we set up a rules-based order, expanded it. It wasn't flawless, but it was the best we've ever had in terms of the world history. But now these bad actors have come along and spoiled it. Maybe it's Putin, maybe it's Xi, maybe it's the autocrats, maybe it's the totalitarians, or maybe it's the populists, the nationalists, the Islamists, the Brexiteers, the Trumpists. But whatever happened, we're in a Cold War. It wasn't our fault. We didn't want it. But now it's time to struggle and do for the good cause of the West. And if you don't sign up for that, then you're a traitor, or you're misguided, or you're working for Chinese or Iranian intelligence. So, setting up our discussion, I'm casting some shadows back to the last Cold War, military-industrial complexes that are in competition, in proxy wars, disinformation, brinksmanship, the testing of boundaries and capabilities. But to bring Geoffrey in, really, it's this emergent Cold War. In many ways, is unlike the conflict between the Soviet Union and the West, and that's really where I'm going to kind of ask you to come in. I mean, obviously, a lot of the historical analogies about the conflict between, for example, Russia and the West spins almost automatically back to Hitler, Putin, Churchill, Zelensky, and that is the most obviously overused historical analogy. And so it would appear that we'd be better off thinking about it in terms of the last Cold War. There's more interesting comparisons. So I just going to...
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, if you're going to use historical analogies at all, then I think the old Cold War, the first Cold War, whatever it is, probably the thing to focus on rather than going back to Hitler and appeasement in the 1930s. Now we begin with this. I think he did this idea of the Cold War as having two fundamental components. On the other hand, preparations for war preparations. But on the other hand, the deterrent effect of the existence of nuclear weapons. Now, but that combination is not true for the early years of the Cold War. And I'm talking about the late 1940s, early 1950s. The early years of the Cold War certainly was about preparations for war. And the assumption was that if the Cold War wasn't resolved, didn't end, then sooner or later there would be a war. Yeah. Okay, but then of course in the 1950s you get the thermonuclear revolution. Yes, where atomic power, atomic bombs that can 1,000 times more powerful than the ones that the Americans dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, like existential threats to the whole of humanity. Nuclear weaponry begins to come online. Okay, then you get this concept of deterrence. becomes very much part of the Cold War. The thing about this concept of terrorism, it's often sort of like tends to be associated with the idea that you have nuclear weapons in order to deter the other side that has nuclear weapons from using them on you. Actually, the function of nuclear weapons during the First Cold War wasn't that. The function of nuclear weapons was actually to deter a major conventional war between the great powers. Yes, that was what that's. It's a deterrent against conventional war rather than nuclear war. The reasoning being, of course, is that if you have the outbreak of a major conventional war among the great powers, then the chance is actually going to escalate into some kind of all-out nuclear war. Now, we come to the present-day situation, and what worries me, it's the first point of worry, if you like, is that the Ukraine war, what's happened in relation to the Ukraine war, has actually not normalized the idea of the possibility of a great power conventional war, i.e., in theory, without the use of nuclear weapons, because given the escalatory actions of the West during the Ukraine war, the proxy war has got as close to a major conventional war between the great powers as it could be without actually being one. And I don't actually see a great deal of distance between the proxy war in Ukraine, as we've experienced over the last 2 years, and an actual a major conventional war between the great powers. And it seems to me also that what has stopped that actually happening is not the fact of the existence of nuclear weapons by both sides. It's the fact that the West is weak conventionally vis-a-vis Russia, and that's what's been exposed by the war. If Western conventional armed forces were actually up to a major conventional war with Russia, I think the prospects of there being such a war would be incredibly enhanced. So, okay, if we are moving into a new Cold War, a renewed Cold War, we're moving into a period in which there is an acute danger of a major conventional war between the great powers, at a much greater danger than there was during the early years of the First Cold War. Right. So that's the first point. Second point, second kind of concern, again, making the Cold War comparison, is that, okay, there was this thing we called the Cold War, but actually and paradoxically, only one side of that conflict, okay, there were lots of sides, but we'll assume there's two sides, only one side of that concept really wanted the Cold War and pursued the Cold War as its project to achieve its political strategic goals. And that side was the Western side. The Soviets didn't actually want the Cold War. The Soviets didn't actually, for the Soviets, what the Soviets were struggling throughout the Cold War was to end the Cold War, to curtail the Cold War, to create some kind of situation of permanent détente. The Soviets didn't want the Cold War. So in that sense, it was a very kind of one-sided struggle. And of course, the Soviet efforts to contain, curtail, and end the Cold War were backed up by an enormous international peace movement, which in its day was very, very powerful, very, very influential. I'd say the biggest peace movement in the 40s and 50s, 60s. It was the biggest peace movement in history so far. Okay, so going back to the emergent new Cold War, this is a Cold War in which we may have is Russia. Oh yeah, so this is the main point. Of course, it was the Soviet Union's struggle for peace, which was a stabilizing factor in the whole Cold War, and one of the fundamental blocks to that Cold War becoming a hot war. But is Russia going to struggle for peace in the same way that the Soviets are? Certainly, if they did, they're not going to be backed up by some a big peace movement. So this new Cold War, you could have both sides actually engaging in the struggle intensely. I think that's going to make it all the more dangerous. Okay, and the third point is this. Again, it's the same theme about how the new Cold War is potentially much, much more dangerous than the old Cold War. And this is to do with the framework within which the struggle is conducted. Now, obviously, the distinguishing feature of the old Cold War relative to the new Cold War is that there was this fundamental ideological political struggle, broadly the struggle between communism and capitalism. So there was a kind of a political, ideological, existential struggle, right? That's what really defines the Cold War. And obviously in the West, they're trying to build up. There's another existential struggle, between authoritarianism and liberalism and stuff like that. But I don't think that really works. But here's the thing, there was that ideological, existential theme of the old Cold War, but it was a struggle conducted by both sides within the framework of the existing international order, i.e., the international order as constituted, I would say, from the 19th century onwards, but particularly from the First World War, and also reinforced by the result of the Second World War. And that's the international order based on the system of sovereign states, based on sovereignty. Yeah, neither side, not even the West, not even the Americans, aspired to overturn that order in order to win their victory or to achieve their goals. So there was the system itself, the existence of international order informed this system of sovereign states, which has been formed and developed over hundreds of years, that wasn't under threat during the First World War. I think it is under threat now, and will be, and may well be in the future, because it seems to me that elements on the Western side of this emerging conflict are prepared to do whatever it takes to achieve their goals, even if that means destroying the existing international order and ushering in a new era of disorder and of real, true anarchy in international politics. So what's at stake in the new Cold War may be not a contest between different types of order or, multipolar versus liberal hegemony. Yeah, sure. I think what's at stake might be international order itself. And that's the most concerning thing.
I'd like to follow up a little bit on this question of how dangerous it is, and the question of, if we go back to the Korean War, for example, this was also quite a dangerous war. If we take the interpretation that Stalin green-lighted North Korea's invasion, which is unclear if he did or didn't, you would be able to tell us about that. But once that war kicked off, we have American forces in Korea, we have MacArthur advocating nuclear strikes against China once the Chinese enter, we have the possibility of that war spiralling out into the European theatre. It seems to me that there's an argument to be made that it was in a way more dangerous because there was a willingness to put troops on the ground. And what's really struck me across the whole of the Ukraine crisis is that, as you've already mentioned yourself, there's not the conventional capability to put men in the field, and there's no political desire to do it. And as much as we hear Macron talking about it, it doesn't feel convincing that there's actually a willingness or a capacity to have NATO troops on the ground doing anything significant in Ukraine. So I wonder if you heard that.
Well, yeah, Stalin did greenlight the war in Korea, and there's no doubt about it. But he greenlighted it on the basis that it was going to be a short, sharp, quick war, and there wouldn't be any broader dangers arising from it. And that turned out to be a fundamental miscalculation because you had this American-led intervention on the side of South Korea, which saved the South Korean regime. And then of course, what happens next is that the US-led coalition advances into North Korea. And then you get the Chinese intervention, but China doesn't intervene directly as a state. It actually intervenes in the form of volunteers, because in the the Ukraine war, there's plenty of foreign volunteers who are actually state-sponsored fighting it, not on the scale as in the Korean war. So yeah, but all the actors in that situation, Stalin, the West, Chinese, were acting with a considerable degree of restraint. It was a limited war. It was in many ways a proxy war, but the element of restraint was quite significant. And there was never at any stage, unless MacArthur got his way and they used atomic bombs to as part of the struggle in Korea itself. It's always what MacArthur went to. But apart from that episode, there was never any question, I don't think, that the Korean War was going to expand into a more general conflict. I don't think you can say that about the Ukraine War. I think it has been and it remains a constant threat, and it remains a constant threat because of because of the way the West has construed it as an existential threat, not just to their hegemony, but to Western civilization as we know it. Yeah, and that's on the basis of that kind of like rhetoric and discourse, that's why they pursued one escalatory action after another. Whereas in the case of the Korean War, time and again, certainly I know for a fact on the Soviet side, the China side, there's restraint is exercised in order to make sure it doesn't go too far. And the same thing applies to the Vietnam Wars, and even more, a much bigger, in many some ways more important proxy war within the Cold War context. But again, there is a considerable degree of restraint. So it's a lack of restraint on the Western side. Now, some people say, "Oh, you're being biased, you're just blaming the West," but but I think that's true. I mean, one can criticize Russia, and Russia does see it as an existential struggle as well. But at the same time, both before the war and throughout the war, there's clear evidence of restraint on the Russian side. There's willingness to negotiate a solution which would preclude war, to negotiate solutions that would end the war. And and even now, I would say, on the Russian side, there is the possibility of a negotiated end to the war. But the problem, the absence, lies clearly on the Western side, and that forms part of its pattern of less and less restrained involvement, intervention in the conflict in Ukraine.
I think an issue which makes it also more dangerous is the mere proximity, because during the first Cold War, at least, the dividing lines in Europe had been clearly delineated. This is the capitalist world, this communist, and we'll do our proxy wars through third parties in the third world. The problem in the new Cold War, which I would argue to a large extent began when we gave up on our agreements for a common European security architecture, and we instead said, well, let's just expand NATO as a hegemonic system, because what we effectively did then is what we call European integration effectively means moving the dividing lines closer to the east and decoupling Russia from its neighbors. So what this means in terms of a Cold War is the regions we're fighting for now is where should the new dividing lines be in Europe, and this is much, much closer to home. So everything, if we have low interest in some remote parts of Africa or in Southeast Asia, that would be one thing. We can always walk away from it. It's not all or nothing. But in Europe, it's just very different. Everything's closer to home, so the intention, desire to go for victory is much greater, and the paranoia for defeat is much greater. But this is also one of the reasons why the Ukraine war was such a disaster. I mean, these days you can't say much, criticize NATO, of course, unless you want to be labeled as a Putin stooge. But, let's look at what Obama said in 2016. He was opposed to sending arms, a large amount of arms to Ukraine. And when he was asked why, he pretty much pointed out the obvious, that Russia was on the escalatory ladder. This is right on their border. If you want to fight a war with Russia and it's on their border, they have the advantage of logistics, and this is
escalation dominance. I think.
Logistic escalation dominance. This is so not only do they have the logistics in place, and this is right on their border, but this also, more importantly, I would say, gives them. It's an existential threat for them. They have more to lose. This is everything. I mean, if NATO would roll into Ukraine in this way, they would be kicked out of the Black Sea. They would see this as the possible disintegration of their state. So they see this, I would say, even reasonably, as an existential threat. And even if we don't agree, certainly there's no doubt this is how the Russians see it. So the mere proximity of this determining where this new dividing lines is, that the Russians had major advantage and they had everything to lose if they fail. So this is why I think it's become so much more dangerous. And I agree with Geoff. The fact that the West hasn't been willing to find any diplomatic solutions, because for the Russians this is either this is all or nothing. Of course, they're happy to do to find a diplomatic settlement, because if they don't need to take over large territories in Ukraine, if it was neutral, it would be fine. But they can't afford to have NATO there. And also, to quote Geoff, one can argue it's a very pro-Russian thing to say, but it's also rooted in reality. For 2 years, the Russians have been pushing for diplomacy, and the West has rejected it. For more than 2 years, we refused to sit down with the Russians. It was not the Russians who refused to have diplomacy with us. So I think, this proximity, for me, this is the fighting over the new dividing lines in Europe. I think this is what makes this very different from the First World War.
Yeah. And to sort of develop maybe some of the causes for the difference between the last Cold War and the emerging Cold War is this question of strategic empathy. So you have an opponent, you may not like them, you may think they're a dreadful regime or a dreadful country, but you understand that they have certain strategic interests and you can empathize with what they are. And so that kind of brings us to the contrast between how Putin's Russia has been viewed in the West as compared to how Stalin was viewed when he was alive in the West, and how Mao even was viewed in that time period at the beginning of the last Cold War. There's a number of elements to this, but it does appear that many people across the political spectrum take a very, very kind of anti-Putin position there, very passionately opposed to him. That's not really how it was in by my understanding of the last Cold War. So I just wondered if that is another element here that could be...
Yeah, I don't think you should exaggerate the degree of strategic empathy in the First World War. In the First Cold War. Yeah,
Same problem.
I think it was the same problem. Yeah, and but you are right about there is this difference in the way Putin is demonized in a way that Stalin never was. I'm the expert on Stalin. The mass murderer and blah 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 blah. But the way Putin is treated by Western politicians or Western media makes Stalin look good. It's a statesman. I think the difference is this though, is that in the West throughout the Cold War in the West there were significant currents of thought, parts of the establishment, intellectuals, think tanks, whatever the equivalents of, who did have a degree of strategic empathy, in relation to what the Soviets and their perspective, So, and there was a different perspective, yes, and it was the and there was a discussion, yes, and it's the existence of that different perspective, that elements of strategic empathy, which made possible developments in the direction of détente, particularly after the Cuban Missile Crisis. The difference today is that there are people like ourselves who do have strategic empathy for the Russians, but overwhelmingly there's this complete absence of strategic empathy compared to the first Cold War. And I keep saying, surely as the war progresses, as it becomes more and more obvious that Ukraine's defeat will be, the longer the war goes on, the more catastrophic will be Ukraine's defeat. Surely they will actually come to their senses and start to exercise, their ability to empathise with the perspective of Russians. But I don't see a lot of evidence. I see them doubling down on their lack of empathy and their refusal to see the Russian point of view, and refusal to accept what the Russians say their motives are and what their concerns are, and then they just dismiss that, say no, that's all propaganda. It's all about imperial expansion, a dictatorship versus liberatism, all of that kind of thing. Yeah.
There's also a sense that any researcher or analyst that carefully, dispassionately reproduces the strategic narrative of China, Iran, Russia runs the risk of just being accused, accusations like you're disseminating the propaganda of hostile states, you're undermining democracy, you're sowing confusion, you're undermining the West's purpose.
Yeah, just let
me finish the point. What is that all about, and how does it compare with this wave of McCarthyism that also was important to the start of the last Cold War?
I will come in, and then maybe Glenn can get on the discussion. Is that it's not just Russia that suffers from this problem of a lack of strategic empathy. It applies to China, and it applies to to Iran as well. Yeah, I think it's important to note that. Yeah, but Gled, maybe you would like to continue on that point.
No, it's where it comes from is a good question, but that was one of my big surprises as well, because I remember back in the day when I was doing my doctorate, I used the security dilemma as the main way of explaining the development of relations between the West and Russia after the Cold War. And I remember going to the first conference and pointing out, what Russia does threatens us, but also what NATO does threatens Russia. And this was, to my surprise, very, very controversial, that the idea that a military alliance would expand towards the Russian borders and cancel all the agreements we had for a pan-European security architecture, that somehow this would be seen as a threat, that this is surely not legitimate. And it's very strange. I think, this conviction that I think the generation that came after the Cold War, that this was essentially the recipe for a perpetual peace, as you began to, with your opening remarks, that we now finally ended all these ideological struggles. There were no more adversaries. We could transcend the realism of the former world and essentially start something entirely different. I think once you believe that the history, that path is kind of set, and you'll become very hostile to any disruption to it. And this is very dangerous, because people conflating empathy with the opposing side as in taking their side. And this is very strange to me, because if you want to maximize your own security, obviously you have to be able to take into account, see things from the opposing side. But I think it's also rooted, therefore, in a new idea, which is the idea that peace is created by defeating your adversaries. Because in the international system defined by an international anarchy, security competition is the key. So everyone's competing for security, and the path to security is usually finding out the areas where your interests can be harmonized and how to resolve the conflicts without resorting to force. But I think that we embrace this idea now in the West that the way to peace is you defeat your adversaries. And I think the end of the Cold War strengthened this. This was one of the key arguments of the American ambassador to the Soviet Union as well, Jack Matlock, because he was pointing out, we negotiated an end to the Cold War in 1989. So the lesson of the Cold War was, sit down with your adversary, take their interest into account, and we can find a common solution. We'll have peace. But then 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed, and you had now a whole new ideology emerging, in which, 1 month after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had President Bush Sr., saying, the Cold War didn't end, it was won, and this legitimized all our struggles in Korea, and this was the foundation, as he said, that the leader of the West is now the leader of the world. So the whole international order of a hegemony rested on this aspect. So I think, the idea that peace is created by negotiations, I think it's very hard to say. It's hard to support these days because we have so much propaganda. And this is what Hans Morgenthau was writing, way back in the days. If you accept that there's a security competition between states, you have to understand the interest of the opponent. However, if you convinced yourself through propaganda that the world is a struggle between good and evil, there can't be any compromise. You have to defeat the adversary. Peace is created when, good vanquishes the evil. And I think, for me, this summarizes the mentality, because we always fighting another Hitler, and you can't negotiate with Hitler. And if you try to understand Hitler, well, you might be a Hitler supporter. And it sounds like a very childish way of thinking, but this is, in my opinion, the dominant mentality we have.
I've got another point about strategic empathy, which is this: like Western elites, policymakers, decision makers, politicians above all, they seem to lack the capacity for strategic empathy as far as Russia is concerned. For example, the same is not true of their voters or Western publics. Yes, all the opinion poll data shows that plenty of people out there, more and more people out there, have no problem with understanding and empathizing with the Russian point of view in this, and seeing Russia's security concerns, seeing that how NATO expansion could be front. They certainly don't have any problem with the idea that the way to peace is to have peace negotiations, not to actually remilitarize them, build up your armed forces, and prepare for a future war. So that the common sense of the public at least gives me some hope there. And the other point it makes is to bring the Gaza into the picture here, because what I think what that crisis has done, it seems to me anyway, it's kind of like prompted more people to exercise strategic empathy in the sense of trying to understand the Israeli perspective and the Palestinian, Arab and Gaza perspective. So I'm hopeful there can be some spillover, and that includes significant sections of the Western media whose coverage of that crisis, that conflict, that war is much more even-handed than the way they've handled the Ukraine war. So I'm hoping there might be some kind of spillover effect into having a new sets of eyes on the Ukraine war, what's going on there. So it's Gaza is a tragedy for sure, huge kind of like human tragedy, but it could have some helpful effects in relation to the Ukraine war and finding a way forward to resolve that conflict.
I agree with what I said, because I think that as the moral collapses further, I think the public becomes a bit more aware. And I do see some similarities, because in Gaza, we're told, if you criticize the genocide or the massacres, they say, oh, well, then you're a Hamas supporter. Do you support them? Because, if you don't fully support this side, that means you support that side. And it's the same when in the Ukraine crisis. If you criticize NATO for provoking the war and sabotaging the peace agreements, then you support Putin, because you have to pick one side and then stick with it. This is the mentality, and also context, of course. If you say, it's what Hamas did to civilians on the 7th of October, you can't excuse this. But the conflict didn't begin on the 7th of October. So if you imply there's context, then now you're legitimizing it. And it's the same with this. Well, the war didn't start in February of 2022. This started 8 years earlier, and we in NATO, we started it when we toppled the government, and then launched this campaign against the Russians before they even took Crimea. But then now you're also legitimizing it, because you're providing context, you're explaining why they did it. So there's a lot of these similarities, but I think as the public now sits back and watches the leaders explain, if you criticize genocide, that means you hate Jews, or obviously you can't call for negotiations. Weapons are the path to peace, and we don't speak with our adversaries. At some point, the public, I think, does begin to question a bit. Perhaps their leaders aren't as virtuous as they claim to be.
This whole idea that you could come and not be on one side or the other, of course, was a big part of the last Cold War, the non-aligned movement, and a whole range of states that said, we don't want to be with the Soviets or the Americans, and we don't want to be any party to a Third World War. And when we come to the current situation, the term that's usually used is the Global South, which we could say is not exactly a geographical term, it's not a very exact term, but the idea is that these states, in similar ways with the last Cold War, are not interested in taking sides. They want to have deals with all countries, and they tend to view, like you're talking about the Western public, view of this war in Ukraine, they go one step further and see it as a proxy war that they don't want to be involved with, and they would like to see it wound down immediately for the benefit of global economy and so on and so forth. So I just wonder, how does that compare with your understanding of the non-aligned movement in the last Cold War? And maybe is that one of the key differences here, because the relative weight of the Global South?
Yeah. Well, of course, what we call the Global South, and it's kind of the independence exercise. Yeah, there's a direct line of continuity from the non-aligned movement in the 1950s, the Bandung Conference as well. Difference, of course, is today's Global South is infinitely more powerful than the non-aligned movement was in the 1950s, and it's an enormously important factor in a pro-peace type direction. If there is going to be some negotiated end to the war, some peace settlement, then I think the global south could play a really, really important role in lobbying and facilitating the negotiations that will have to take place. Yes, I was of huge importance. Again, the global south, people and politicians in the global south, they don't have any problem with exercising their human ability to emphasize, to see different points of view, to see the Russian point of view, see the Russian interests, as well as obviously having a huge degree of, which I do as well, a huge degree of empathy for the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian people and all the damage that is suffering, the disaster. The Ukraine is being destroyed by this war. The longer it goes on, the more chances are that there'll be no recognizable independent Ukrainian sovereign state at the end of it. So obviously, I'm a Russia specialist and historian, and historians obviously specialize in this. That's what we do. We empathize, explain different points of view, particularly different points of view that we don't share, or we have differences with ourselves. So obviously, there's a natural kind of I have a natural empathy for the Russian perspective, yes. But that doesn't stop me from exercising my strategic empathy in relation to Ukraine, or actually in relation to the West, the Western perspective as well. We need to make an effort in that. There are Western sensibilities involved here. So any peace settlement, any reconstruction of relations with Russia, if that's at all possible, will involve accommodating Western sensibilities as well as Ukrainian and Russian sensibilities as well.
I think at this stage we maybe would move over to Glenn because you've been arguing for quite some time, quite a while, to some cost as well, against the grain of the kind of general analysis of how this new Cold War is emerging, and that kind of analysis where the blame is at the foot of Russia, specifically Putin. This is a revanchist international spoiler that wants to tear down the rule-based order. There's others like you, Gilbert Achcar I mentioned already, Noam Chomsky, of course, and a similar strand of thinkers, left-wing thinkers, Jeffrey Sachs, who was in some of these institutions that were involved in the post-Cold War era, and John Mearsheimer, we have to mention him. So, this is the kind of group, it's a rather small group and an eclectic group in some ways, but you recently brought out a book this year, The Ukraine War and Eurasian World Order, and if what I've read of the book so far, you're kind of contrasting the American grand strategy for, a global hegemony and maintaining it you're contrasting that with, what's the role of Russia, China, other countries in Eurasia, and is there going to be a kind of Eurasian Westphalian system that emerges? So that kind of multipolar system of sovereign states that have a mutual commitment to collective balance of power, but also forestalling any attempts for one of these countries to make a grasp for hegemony. So this is a kind of equilibrium that you describe in the book. So I wonder if you could just say something about how you would relate your interpretation of the changing world order to this question of the nature of a new Cold War.
Sure. Well, in terms of whenever we use concepts like a new Cold War, it's quite helpful because concepts they pack together a vast amount of complexity, but they can also mislead. And I think that the problem of comparing this to the old Cold War is you had two potential hegemons with two competing universalist ideologies, effectively, in competition for supremacy. And this is very different from what's going on now. There's no, for example, in our struggle with Russia, despite the rhetoric, Russia is not restoring the Soviet Union. Russia neither has the capability or the intention to dominate, the Eurasian landmass. At most, they're hoping to have some equilibrium within Greater Eurasia, which means they recognize China will be the largest economy, But if you have a balance of powers, other large states, be it India, with the Russians, Iranians, Japanese, Koreans, and it will be fine. The Chinese will lead, but they can't dominate. And dominate means you can dictate the policies of others. So I think this is a very important difference. So this is why, and I like the reference to Gramsci, which is why I used that quote as well, because I think this is all the struggles we have now with Russia, in the Middle East, China. This all have the same origin, which is, again, the old world is dying and the new one hasn't been born yet, and is also being prevented from being born. And the world that's dying is the hegemonic world order, because the Westphalian system, which is the modern world order, it came to be as hegemony collapsed. You had then many centers of power. Also, there were no longer any universal idea values under the Catholic Church who could then assert legitimacy to rule over all people. So universalism was gone, and the center of power was gone. So when we talk about world order, it's largely about the international distribution of power and the justification for whatever rules you have, and for what the rules will be of the game. Now, after the Cold War, there were debates, also academic debates, about what would be the new world order. The term world order came up over and over. Would we then return into a Westphalian system that is several poles of power, and if anyone strives for hegemony, the other will collectively balance them, one based on sovereign equality, accommodating many centers of power? This will be one option. Or the second option would be another, Pax Romana, a new hegemon. And this would then entail one center of power, and then using universal values to effectively create a system based on sovereign inequality. Because, why would a hegemon will enjoy full sovereignty, but if you rule over the rest of the international system, they're going to have diminished sovereignty. Now, the United States obviously went with the hegemonic option. And would emphasize as well, I think, that most had genuinely benign intentions, because the main assumption is if you have a dominant power, then it's assumed that this can reduce the international anarchy. So it mitigates great power rivalry, because no one's competing for dominance. There is a dominant power. So the power struggle is then mitigated. But also then you have the opportunity to elevate the role of liberal democratic values. And I think many people genuinely believe that if we can introduce more humanitarian law into international law, we can have a more peaceful international system in which everything isn't power politics. And this was the objective, the New World Order. And this is also what we pursued in Europe. And this manifested itself as abandoning the Charter of Paris for a New Europe, the OSCE, all of these collective European security institutions, and instead going with NATO expansion, which is effectively the Americans ruling, and with all of Europe included, except the Russians, of course. And the problem, though, was always, as critics also recognized in the early 90s, is it's unavoidably it's a temporary phenomenon, this unipolarity or hegemony, because the power distribution is it can't be maintained over time. Like all empires, it will begin to, the resources will begin to be taken from the core to the periphery. So it's expensive, and the US would start to run itself into debt. It would have economic problems, economic disparities. This would have social problems, political instability. So again, what you're seeing today with 34 trillion in the hole, and all the socio-economic and political problems which comes with it. And that's just what would happen within the US. But then at the same time, what would happen if one aspires for hegemon? Well, you have to also prevent the rise of rival powers or even friendly powers, because then it's no longer a hegemonic system. So now this is a key objective of NATO expansion, of course, to contain and weaken the Russians, perpetuate the weakness they had in the 90s. This is also why we would have economic warfare against the Chinese. But if you try to keep everyone else down, they will then begin to come together collectively to balance you. And this is what you see with BRICS, the SCO, all these institutions where they're now seeking to decouple economically from the US, at least reduce dependence and the political West, and instead seek more economic integration with each other. So this is how you see just the power dimension. But then also you have the legitimacy aspect, because hegemon doesn't only bleed resources, it also bleeds legitimacy over time, because this becomes an ambolt around your neck if you're going to run an empire. And so we saw that the main system, a hegemonic system, or this liberal international order which they try to establish, it's not that it doesn't conform with international law under the UN Charter, because the UN Charter sovereign equality is a key principle. We all have the same sovereignty, and this is why you balance hegemons. Now, after the Cold War, gradually the United States began to introduce the so-called rules-based international order and push out international law. And so it's important to distinguish the differences, because international law, again, is based on sovereign equality. The liberal international order attempts to combine international law with humanitarian law. So, but this results in no rules at all. You have two sets of rules, and then you can pick and choose, which is why it's rejected by everyone. Not everyone, but outside NATO, you don't find much support for it. So I think this you saw this already began with the invasion of Yugoslavia. The Americans, they would, after NATO invaded, it was obviously illegal. It went against the UN Charter. However, it was said to be legitimate. So this was quite interesting, and this was a foundation of the liberal international order. You decoupled legitimacy from legality. And what is alternative legitimacy? Well, it's liberal democratic values, because of the human rights abuses in Yugoslavia. So now you had kind of two systems, and you saw the same rhetoric coming after the invasion of Iraq, the recognition. We can't rely on the UN because, authoritarian states might try to constrain us. So we need a different authority. So this is when we began to speak of an alliance of democracies, concert of democracies, league of democracies. So all this, more or less the same as what we now refer to as the liberal international order, which means, you can pick and choose which principles. So, for example, in Kosovo, what did we do? Do you go with territorial integrity in accordance with UN, international law, or self-determination, which is the humanitarian argument? And we can pick and choose. So we go with humanitarian. Okay, so they can have self-determination. So we ignore the UN. When near Crimea, the very similar instance, vast majority wanted to secede and join Russia. Well, then you can't have self-determination. Now you want to have territorial integrity. So you pick and choose, and it's always power interests at the foundation. So the result of this is, of course, that other countries also reject the whole thing. So the whole international order that we're pushing. So the international distribution of power has shifted, and the legitimacy is gone. Especially after what's happening now in Gaza, no one's really buying our liberal arguments anymore, and this is why the unipolarity is gone, and it's very difficult to bring it back now. And so the rest of the world are now pushing for establishing multipolarity. They want many centers of power, especially they're not just military but economic. So several centers for technologies, industries. They want new transportation corridors, use their own currencies and their own payment systems. So across the board, they want to have several centers of power. But meanwhile, in the West, we haven't accepted this yet, especially then with the United States. They would like to restore hegemony, because our entire order after the Cold War, perpetual peace, one central power, liberal democratic norms, the West essentially having the prerogative to make up the rules as it goes along. It was a very good deal, and also it was a deal which all our current politicians grew up in. So we're trying to get this back, but by doing this, peace depends on, again, defeating your adversaries. You have to crush the Russians, you have to knock down the Chinese, prevent them from growing further economically. Israel has to be able to do what it wants. Any challenges like Iran have to be crippled. This is the path to peace, defeating your adversaries. And this is what we don't understand, because in the rest of the world, yeah, of course, our adversaries, be it Russia or China, it makes sense. They will oppose this. But what you see in the rest of the world, be it from Turkey, India, Latin America, they don't want unipolarity. And this is why, while they don't support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they don't support NATO's proxy war against Russia either. They don't want to see Russia defeated or China broken and then have restored this dominance of the West, where they all live under, the rules-based international order. So this is where we are now. Unipolarity is already gone, but we're rejecting the multipolar system. So we're now pulling in two different directions, and this is where all the chaos is unleashed. And everyone is willing to sacrifice everything because, as you said, everything is at stake now. But also there's no rules. So we're willing to take huge risks, but there's no clear rules, which is what you see now. Cameron, let's take our missiles, shoot them into Russian cities if you want, paraphrasing, of course. This is, this can go really, really wrong. But this is, the main risk. This is why so much is at stake. It's not just one conflict. It's the world order, which we are now fighting over.
I think you've really skillfully developed this picture of why it's a dangerous interregnum. And there's a few different strands to go through. But one is, I want to take a line from the book that I think really captures this very well. And I quote, the perpetuation of US hegemony demands the recreation of Cold War dividing lines and conflicts that ensure that adversaries are weakened while allies remain dependent and obedient. The US converts security dependence into geo-economic and political loyalties. The challenge of the system is that excessive peace reduces the influence of the US and allied states. On the other hand, excessive tensions incentivize adversaries to decouple geo-economically from America. Now, that's the quote from the book, and you've kind of talked it through very clearly with your comments. My kind of question is, there are people who have a realist logic, who work in the Pentagon, who work in influential bodies in the West, and surely they see this paradoxical situation and the danger of what you might call overextension and being caught out. There seems to be that's on the one hand. But as you've just outlined, the elites appear to completely believe in this kind of binary logic of all or nothing, all eggs in one basket on Ukraine. If we don't prevail in Ukraine, we lose everything. So I'm wondering, do we have any kind of grounds to maybe hoping that there are some smart people in some rooms that are talking about this in the right way, but what's in the public domain for public consumption? Can we really take it, at face value? Well, this is the kind of question, because
well, this is why, in the Westphalian system, alliances is an important instrument. That is, if one country attempts to expand, the others will collectively balance. But this is wartime alliances. A lot of realist scholars still always warn that peacetime alliances is very destructive because, for a variety of reasons, it necessitates the perpetuation of conflict because the entire power structure is premised on the continuation of violence. And this was Gorbachev. He mentioned this to the Americans actually towards the end of the Cold War. If we pursue peace, we have to make adjustments because their alliance systems is predicated on having this perpetual conflict. So, of course, both sides would lose a lot of influence. And this is a problem for the Americans after the Cold War because once the Europeans became less dependent on the security guarantees from the Americans, the Americans were less able to convert the security guarantees into political influence. So suddenly the Europeans started to pursue their own interests. And this is why American influence in Europe has, benefits from maintaining some tensions and conflicts with Russia at least. And you see the same in Asia. Whenever there's a conflict between the Chinese and the Indians, how excited does the American media get? Why? Because now a huge, powerful state like India will now be a partner in balancing the Chinese, and also instead of insisting on all this, on being a non-aligned power and independent foreign policy, they will now have to submit themselves to some extent, like the Japanese had to after the Second World War. So, and I guess the best example of this was also in the Middle East, because there the Chinese came in and then negotiated this detente between the Iranians and the Saudis. And what was fascinating to me was, then they began to do the same with the other Arab states, trying to settle this. But and then you had the former chief of Mossad in Israel going out to Haaretz saying, listen, if we're going to dismantle the whole anti-Iranian alliance, maybe we should try to make our peace with Iran as well. And this comes at a huge cost to the United States. Look, when they wanted to bomb Yemen, for example, the Saudis didn't want to join in. The United Arab Emirates didn't want to join in. So suddenly they lose a lot of influence because you want to fight with proxies, not stand on your own. So there's always an interest in maintaining some conflicts, because if you want a hegemonic system, you have to weaken adversaries, and you have to make sure that your allies remain obedient and dependent. And this is why, and again, this is not from me, this is an old idea from realist scholars. This is why it's so dangerous to have these peacetime alliances. And my main argument is this peacetime alliances is built into a hegemonic system. This is a key weakness.
I want to bring in one more historical analogy. This is something that these are some points that were made by Niall Ferguson, a historian, in a discussion at the Nixon Institute. I can't remember the exact name of the event, but he was making the comparison of 1970 and saying when Nixon decided to push for an end of the Vietnam War and a détente with Maoist China, that there's a lot of parallels with America right now, in as far as, first of all, there's inflation, America's divided at home, there's a war that's been a failure. I mean, America's also failed in previous wars, Afghanistan, Iraq. He's saying, well, he's advocating this idea that, why doesn't America want to move towards détente? Not because they love Russia or they love China, but simply because they're in a weak situation, and realpolitik dictates the need to have some kind of temporary détente to buy time. But instead, it looks like the opposite is happening. Instead, we've got brinksmanship and testing, the boundaries and pushing to the limits. Now, this comes to a question of, how you interpret the Biden administration as a political brain trying to navigate these choppy waters, navigate this dangerous interregnum. I wonder, if you've got any thoughts on that, and also, do you think anything can change if Trump comes in? So it's a kind of a double barrel, this question. And
well, I think sorry.
Let's make a point about Ferguson. Yeah, I'm not sure if he makes the point in this particular broadcast or whatever you're talking about. But yeah, he is making these kinds of arguments, and he's saying the West is weak, it has all these problems, but he's also saying it's facing this huge disaster in Ukraine in terms of losing the war and all the consequences of that. But the conclusion he draws from that is not the obvious one, is that if you're in a position of weakness and you're fighting this losing proxy war, which could have all immense negative consequences, then you want to get out of the situation. That's not Ferguson's conclusion. What he says is he doubles down. He doubles down on the West. This is so important to the West. The West cannot afford to lose, no matter how risky it is, no matter how challenging and problematic. So he's doubling down on Western involvement in the Ukraine war, which is what all the Western hardliners, they're making this, the similar argument. Yeah. So there's this kind of level of Western fanaticism that seems to override all these kind of realist calculations, which Glenn in his book suggests might be applicable in these different situations. So I don't know. So I'm not so sure it's a question. This is a more human kind of failing or a human problem, rather than being a kind of function of the dynamics of international politics at a particular stage in its development.
Well, I think it's a political problem. Actually, I have a huge part in the book about the collapse of diplomacy and why this has happened. But first, in terms of this on Ferguson, I agree with the premise, because I think what's come with the Vietnam War, which he refers to, but also Iraq and now now Ukraine is the idea that, well, that's not his point, but from my perspective, the British and then the Americans, they've been offshore balancers. This is a nice position to have, because what you do is you stand outside the conflict, and this is why the British and Americans will enter the war late, because you wait for everyone else to exhaust themselves, and then you come in. You don't need total victory; just make sure that you leave the settlement with a balance of power. So the Germans, the Russians, everyone will balance each other, and then you pull out to save your resources. And the warning has always been, if you go in as an offshore power and stay there, then you will slowly be drained and you will exhaust your resources, and the other states in the system will begin to work together against you. And this is why there's always been this push towards just restore. If a balance of power has been disrupted, go in, get a settlement which restores it, and then pull out. Essentially, preserve the Westphalian system. This has been a key logic of the offshore balancing. And this obviously hasn't been done. And I forgot where I was going with it, but anyways, what I was going to say also with the diplomacy, I think one of the reasons why it's failed, which also points to the human era, I think, is diplomacy itself changed in the 90s, because at this point, diplomacy used to mean we have some mutual understanding, we find compromises, see how we can avoid conflicts. But after the Cold War, the assumption was, with one central power, diplomacy meant to socialize others. And this is, what the language of EU, NATO, all of them said, we have to socialize the rest of the world. So if you want to have diplomacy, you put conditions, and if you do the right thing, you'll be invited into the meetings. If you don't do what we want, we will, cancel diplomacy. So you saw institutions like the NATO Russia Council, supposed to resolve differences. The first conflict we had in Georgia, we suspended it. We stopped talking to the Russians, like 12-year-old girls in the schoolyard. It's quite extraordinary. But again, this is the assumption now of diplomacy. It's you're rewarding other states. It's not a way to resolve conflicts. And so I think this is also, the idea that you can't talk to your adversaries. And like whenever you see the leaders explain why, well, if we meet with Putin or Xi or like whoever it is we're having conflict with, we're legitimizing them. So we have to deprive them of legitimacy. And this is why you meet with people. You give them or deprive them of legitimacy. So I think, diplomacy itself has suffered greatly.
One part of Ferguson's argument that I think I will bring up and defend a bit more is that it is detrimental to US interests to bring Iran, China, Russia together with these alienating acts that you just described, this kind of approach of stigmatization because of failed socialization. The question is really, the need to build the threat, justify the coalition and the sense of purpose for the West, but then it becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy where you create an autocratic bloc that one day meets in Beijing to announce the formation of a greater Eurasian core prosperity sphere, which will be more powerful than the USSR ever was, and beyond our capacity to contain or do anything about. So there seems to be a tension here, where I come back to Ferguson, and I agree. I don't know, it'll be as hardline as you say about Ukraine, but that realist argument.
But Matthew, why do they do that then? You expose this tension. How do you explain them taking the position and it seems an absolutely crazy thing to do, to take actions which is going to solidify your enemies and strengthen them and weaken your own position? So why do they do it? Yeah? My suggestion is you can't explain that completely in realist terms, in terms of balances of power and all of that kind of discourse. I think that's only part of the explanation. It seems to be fundamental to the explanation is Western universalism, Western supremacism. That's at the heart of their what is seemingly irrational kind of behaviour and their failure to actually calculate. And take some realist decisions which are in their own interest, in the interest of their own states and their own people.
Yeah, I lost my thought before, but that's where I was going with after the offshore balancing. That was my point. That if the United States will pull back, but it can't, because if you're hegemon, you have to be everywhere. And this is the problem, why I argue this is not about us and them, like this is not in our interest either. But if the US would pull back, the idea would be there would be a natural balance of power emerging. And this is, of course, a problem. Like, look now, for example, the Americans go over to China, they try to convince them, help us put sanctions on the Russians, let's break them. Meanwhile, all these American leaders are saying the same thing. After we've broken Russia, our key objective with breaking Russia is that we can focus all our resources on the Chinese. So it does make sense to go after everyone at the same time. But that's what you have to do when there's no priorities, because once you have to dominate every corner of the world, there is no priorities. Now, my point is, if the United States would pull back, it doesn't mean that the Chinese and Russians would turn on each other. I think they're developing a lot of mutually beneficial economic cooperation. But there would be at least a balance of dependence that is several centers of power. And this is why a lot of the policies, the hegemonic policies, they're very counterproductive, because they prevent a proper multipolar system from emerging where there's a balance. Look, for example, at the Eurasian Economic Union. It's an institution where Russia institutionalizes a lot of the economic influence it has in Central Asia. Well, the Central Asia is having growing dependence on China. Why would you undermine the Eurasian Economic Union when this helps to create a more balanced Central Asia? And even the Russians are even inviting in India into the Central Asia. No, so they don't want to dominate it; they just want to have a balance, so the Chinese won't be too powerful. But by undermining this, you're strengthening your main adversary, which is the Chinese. Same as with, why would you talk the Indians into cutting ties with Iranians? Now Iran has to lean more towards China. How was this a great idea? And so you see this same thing over and over again. And I think, this is where the problem is. It makes sense if you could have a hegemonic world order, but if you can't, this undermines a preferable multipolar system. Even the Europeans understood this. The French and the Germans, before the Russian invasion, they said we have to keep good economic connections with Russia, so not too much of their economic interests ends up with China. That made sense. The Japanese were thinking the same. Now America's pressuring everyone to cut ties with Russia. Russia aligns more with China, and this will strengthen China's hand significantly. This is not the balanced system you want. And so what you say is you achieve what you don't want, which is strengthening of a China-centric order, because the Russians don't want that. They would like to have. This is why they're having this north-south corridor with the Indians. They would like to not be anti-Chinese, but diversify the economic connectivity in the region to make sure no one is too dependent on one center of power. Now you avoid the hegemon from emerging. This is Westphalian system, and this is good for America. Now they can pull back a bit, lick their wounds, restore their economic strength without pushing all their adversaries in effectively what looks more and more like an alliance against them.
But at the moment, Glenn, it does not. So they are going to step back.
Oh no!
I mean, so if they're not going to step back and, as you put it, restore some kind of balance, say, okay, the hegemony comes to an end, but they're still in the balancing position themselves. They're not. They're still very powerful. Yeah, but they're good. They're doubling down on an outright victory in the struggle with Russia and China, and that, in my view, portends disaster. Potentially, cataclysmic military disaster, but also more likely, some kind of collapse of international orders, fragmentation. The idea, the end of international society as we know it.
Yeah, and I think this is a problem, because if you want to mobilize now against all these adversaries, what do you do? Well, you want to recreate essentially the dividing lines of the Cold War. So you're saying you have to mobilize your allies. So you're saying, this is a struggle between liberal democracies and authoritarian states, and you're creating this dividing lines where you're essentially telling your allies you have to be in this bloc versus this bloc. And this is again the peacetime blocs, which is devastating for world peace and the stability in the international system. And you're breaking up not just trade agreements, but the diplomatic agreements across the board. So I think it's horrific, and this is why I find it so annoying, this dumbed down debate of you support this side or this side. But we never really have a serious discussion if perhaps multipolarity would be more beneficial to accept several centers of powers, which would then allow countries like the United States to recover, because at the moment the US and the collective West, we weaken ourselves year by year in relative power at least, while other powers are growing stronger, integrating more with each other, becoming less reliant on us. This is a good time to reconsider whether or not the hegemonic path has come to an end and we should pursue a different path. Like, the point of departure is what is in our national interest. We don't have that. We say hegemony, or you're, regurgitating the Russian propaganda. And this is, what's very frustrating.
And within that kind of framework, one of the difficulties is seeing any green shoots in the West. So, I'm going to attempt to lay out what may or may not be green shoots, depending on how you view it. One particularly orange-tinged green shoot is, of course, Trump, who may come back into the office of president this year. Is there any evidence to suggest that he understands even an iota of what you've laid out? This question of preserving American power by careful restraint and allowing because one of the fundamental points here is, even if America can't dominate or interfere with Eurasia, they're always going to be a powerful country, given the kind of hemispheric dominance they have and the just natural resources and all the kind of advantages they have. They're not going to turn into a midget power overnight, like the United Kingdom after World War II. That's not feasible. So coming back to this idea, is there any evidence of that kind of shift being possible in a Trump administration?
There's certainly people connected to Trump or around Trump who precisely understand that and argue that position. It's time to step back. We shouldn't be afraid to step back. We should be afraid of rebalances of power, and that's in Americans' interest. That will actually strengthen the United States' position. So I think there are people like whether or not they could have an impact on Trump. I mean, that's another question because last time what we saw was he comes to power on a policy of America first, but actually he appoints all these neocons into positions of power in his administration. Let's not forget, it was the Trump administration that authorized the supply of lethal weapons to Ukraine on a large scale. That's where this war came from. In the latter part of the Trump administration, the significant strengthening of Ukrainian military forces and their integration into NATO structure, and Biden just continued that policy onwards. So I don't know. I'm very skeptical about the difference that Trump will make at this stage.
Yeah, a month into the war as well. I mean, a month after Russia invaded, he made an interview as well where he said that he would have sent more weapons in because this was so grotesque. And he said, we've never seen anything like this since World War II, the way they're bombing. And this was quite extraordinary because Newsweek or Economist, one of those at that time, they had an article as well pointing out that, well, actually the Russians, the amount of bomb America dropped on Iraq on the first day was more than Russia dropped on Ukraine in the first month. So, historical facts weren't really in place. I mean, we haven't seen this since World War II is simply not correct. But I share Geoff's pessimism. I don't think he would have significantly different policies. Again, he sent the weapons initially to Ukraine, which began to get this ball rolling. But also the efforts to take him down. This is what sparked the Russiagate hoax, which effectively since 2016 has fueled a lot of this crisis. So, but I think it matters to some extent because he's very different as a populist president. But he still wants the empire. He just he wants a return on investment. So for example, Obama he prioritized the Trans-Pacific Partnership and all of these institutions. But the main idea would be, the main opposition by Trump was not that they didn't want to write the trading rules for Europe or for Asia. The main problem was, if it's America first, he's worried that, NAFTA, within the club, the productive resources transition to Mexico. Or same in the Asia-Pacific Partnership. his main concern was that the productive power of the US would gradually be transferred to allies. So he was more worried about America being weakened by its allies. And this is not an acceptable cause to keep, to put a check on the adversaries. So I think it's just he wants a greater return. So I'm less optimistic, and he might have learned from his last administration, because putting Bolton and all of this, I don't know. I talked to his military advisor, and he said that if Trump gets back in, he's not going to make this mistake again. He's going to have a more hardline crew, because I think he was trying to buy his acceptance with the blob, if you will, by taking on some of the neocons.
I mean, Trump has said this himself, hasn't he? In a recent interview, he said, I've learned a lot from a first term. I mean, there is this argument going around. It depends on who Trump practices his vice president. Right. That will signal, that may signal whether he's serious about a radical shift in policy. I think the other thing is if he does come back into office, what stage is the Ukraine war at? Yeah, I think if it's in the final stages of defeat, then I think Trump could make a difference in the sense of going with the flow and getting out, ending the war, and blaming it on Biden or whatever the negative consequences that. If it's sort of dragging on, and it's it's still a kind of live thing in a sense, then Trump might listen to all kinds of siren voices about the need to continuing U.S. involvement in the war. And we saw that recently, of course. That depends what the political calculations are. The $61 billion, 61, 68. As far as I can see, the key move in that whole process was when, Johnson, the Speaker of the House, went and saw Trump in Florida, and Trump gave the signal that the United States should continue to support support Ukraine. Yeah, so he's capable of all kinds of different things depending on the situation and how he calculates it politically. But at least Trump does make this weird.
Yeah. Yes, we'll find out when it comes to the presidential election campaign and the degree to which he focuses in on Ukraine as a means of really hammering the Democrats and their so-called incompetence. Because then he'll put himself in the Eisenhower situation where he is elected on the promise of delivering an end to the Ukraine war and getting the Americans out. So just to kind of wrap things up in this final kind of segment, there's a couple of points left. One is that I realized that to some extent all three of us are engaged in swimming against the current, swimming upstream on the river when everyone else is just relaxing, going downstream. And by this I particularly mean the framing in your book, Glenn, is very much focusing on the American sort of imperialism, this attempts to retain hegemony, whereas a lot of the focus is on the other's idea that Russia has an imperialist agenda, China has an imperialist agenda, Iran has an imperialist agenda. These are the evil empires, and they want to subvert, and they want to control regions, and they want to take on historical enemies, and so on and so forth. So you have already, to some extent, kind of pushed back on that. But, it would be amiss of me not to mention that, because it's kind of a big thing that gets thrown out at all these different discussions that we attend or we're participating in. That's the fundamental thing to be asked. So I wonder if, there is a way to respond to that. Why is it that we should be always starting with the discussion of American imperialism first, and then look at all the other kind of attempts as something like secondary?
Well, I mean, when all said and done, it was Putin that decided to invade Ukraine and start the war. So I think in that sense, I think it's legitimate to start with Russia and with Putin. Okay. But having said that, there is no evidence whatsoever that Putin has any intention or capabilities of pursuing ambitions and goals beyond his relatively limited security goals in Ukraine. Yeah, so obviously, by definition, as part of pursuing Russian security, Putin is expanding into various Ukrainian territories. Now, if you want, you can label that imperialist. I personally don't find it very helpful because underlying that what territories is he expanding into, and why is he doing that? What does the actual people living in those territories? So I think that there is a legitimate discussion to be had about Russia's responsibility for the situation, Putin's decision making, and what his greater goals might be. But my general take is that the war from Putin's point of view was a defensive of action, and that at the end of the day he would be prepared to settle the conflict on the basis of some kind of compromise peace that satisfied Russia's security goals in relation to NATO, but also offered protection to the remaining pro-Russian parts of the Ukrainian population. So that would be my response to that question.
Well, I think it makes sense to use the United States as the main example because they have explicit hegemony in their security strategy, that there can only be one center of power and no other state should even, or collection of states should even be able to aspire to challenge it. So this is only one state with this. And well, to start with China, I think, again, a lot of the conflicts usually over Taiwan, but it's important to distinguish between the status quo and the revisionist power, because the peace with China since the 70s, and indeed the Asia as a region, Asia Pacific, has been based on this one China policy. And it's the United States which seems to gradually be contesting it by asking for more representation of Taiwan in the UN, sending military advisors, troops to Taiwan, and emboldening the nationalists to pursue secession. So I think this suggests that China isn't challenging the status quo. Now, also, if you look at power and intention from the China, which is capabilities and intention, how you should assess threats, it's worth pointing out that if you're hegemonic power, you want to make sure everyone just becomes excessively dependent on you, not others. But if you see how they, for example, work with the Russians, they haven't opposed anything when the Russians reach out to Iran, India, to diversify their dependencies to avoid excessive reliance on China. They said, well, fine, we're not a hegemon. And of course, one can say this, but also if you look at their policies, they have this global civilization initiative where they suggest that every state has are distinctive, they all have their own path to development. This call for distinctive values and civilizations, this is the opposite of universal values. If you're aspiring empire, you want to refer to Marxist values or liberal values as a way of asserting a sovereignty over other peoples to diminish their sovereignty. So I don't see the capabilities yet or the intentions of China. It doesn't mean that over time, if they get in the same position as the United States to be all this power concentrated in China, of course, their views of the world can start to reflect around this, which is why you want a balance of dependence around Eurasia and Africa. You don't want only one player. So, but I don't see any imperial intentions from China or at this point, or not capabilities yet either. In terms of Russia, I would also say they've also been defined most as a status quo power, not revisionist after the Cold War. I mean, it's NATO that began to expand. And I think this is a key mistake in all our analysis, because we did the same in Georgia. Oh, they're going to conquer all of Georgia. But they didn't. They could have. But they pushed them out of South Ossetia, and this restored the status quo. And this was the same after we toppled the government in Ukraine. They saw what was going to happen. We're going to push them out of their naval base. So they took Crimea to assert control over their naval base in the Black Sea. So I would see it more as I don't see the imperial intent. And I can understand why many people would immediately get very aggressive and go on the comment field now and how dare you. But this didn't start as a territorial conflict. Again, I would remind people from the beginning of the 90s, what the Russians were calling most for was for the West to live up to its agreements according to the Charter of Paris for a New Europe, to establish a Europe based on the OSCE, an inclusive security institution. When we decided to go with NATO, both Yeltsin and Putin said, well, we can join NATO. Let's all be in the same club. Let's not have this block system. They proposed under Medvedev a new European security architecture. Putin suggested this Eurasian Union. They tried over all the time, and then when we toppled the government well, as we were toppling the government in Ukraine, they even suggested, how about we have a trilateral agreement? The EU, Ukraine, and Russia. They don't have to choose. We can all be a part of a greater Europe. This was the main objective. This is not an imperialist one. This would also be good for Ukraine to diversify. And it was only after we toppled the government, when they took Crimea, and also they got involved, well, indirectly at least, or covertly in Donbass. But even then, with the Minsk agreement, they said you can reintegrate Donbass into Ukraine, but under the Minsk agreement, they have to have the autonomy and all of the above. And we what's come out now, we rejected this for 8 years, sabotaged it. And then Russia invades. What did it do? From first day of invasion, they went to the Ukraine and said, listen, we can restore neutrality. If you restore your neutrality, we'll pull out from where we were before the invasion. And so this was a pressure. It wasn't for territory. It was the US and the UK who sabotaged this and said, no, we'll fight the Russians, with the Ukrainians. And as then the war dragged on and then they began to realize, NATO said, we're not going to have diplomacy with you. As soon as this war is done, Ukraine will join NATO. What would you do if you're in Moscow, if you see this as an existential threat? Well, now, to make sure these territories don't fall under NATO control, you take them yourself, which is why they will lose more and more territory. And at the end of this, they will lose everything from Kharkov to Odessa unless we sit down and talk to them, because they can't afford to have Odessa be a NATO city effectively. And this is why I find it so horrific that we're not talking, because we're, if we don't want the Russians to have Odessa, then we say we won't have it either. Restore neutrality, and this will be a way of saving the Ukrainian nation. But anyways, my point was, territory is the symptom. It's not the cause of this. So I don't see it as an imperial struggle for this or war from this perspective. But I know this will cause a lot of it. Unfortunately, this is a controversial statement, but it shouldn't be, because the facts, they should speak for themselves.
Could I add to that? I think that Russia, China, Iran, even North Korea, many other states actually, not just those ones, are status quo states in a very fundamental sense, that they are defenders of the existing international system. The existing international society, as I would call it, based on sovereignty, based on international law, based on diplomacy, based on common institutions. And what they're seeking to do is to defend that society. In fact, not just to defend it, but to restore it from the erosion of it that occurred during the unipolar moment of the 1990s. Soviet Union and Communist China during the Cold War, that they were staunch supporters of international society, and they continue to be all the way through the post-war period up to the present time. And it's the United States and its allies that wants to, overturn the system, yes, and turn into, they want to universalize their own system, their own so make international society into a Western-dominated international society, and that's why I see as being, the fundamental struggle of one that's going on at the present time. It's what is going to be the character of international society moving forward. Is it going to be the classic Westphalian sovereignty-based system, or is it going to be some hegemon-based system, which is what the United States and the West appears to aspire to?
Well, I think that's why it's important to see it through this prism of a struggle to restore a Westphalian system, because much like in the 19th century when the British and the Russians were fighting each other, or competing at least, and then at the periphery you have, America emerging, the Germans, Japanese, all these new centers of power. This is going to be the outcome this time as well. It's not as if, we lose the war in Ukraine now, Russia will dominate the world. This is, not the 19th or 20th century. It's not going to happen. But what's happening now is when we're throwing away all these resources and also throwing away all the rules of the systems. So, for example, seizing the Russian assets. This alone is very destructive. Look what they're seeing now, thinking in China, India. They will all now reduce their reliance on the West. Not just currencies, but technologies, transportation corridors, everything. Payment system, insurance systems, by the way. The Indians still want to trade with the Russians, so they're all diversifying. So I think this is what's going to be one of the main consequences, is that the Russians will come out that much stronger from this, but it's that the rest of the world will increasingly decouple from the West and seek to have more independent policies. And if you want an independent foreign policy from the West, if you want to withstand its pressure, doesn't matter if you're an ally or a friend or an adversary, you're going to have to reduce your dependency. This is, from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, India, South America. This is what everyone's doing. So I think how the world is transforming around, I think this is the main issue. This is why the Westphalian system is now intensifying, coming into place, while the Russians and NATO are, battling out in Ukraine.
To finish things off, we talked about at the start of our discussion the slide to war, and it seems like this is a good way to end. Is this the most dangerous period of this war in Ukraine so far in terms of it exploding into a hot war? What do we need to look out for in the coming months, the rest of this year? And when you think about maybe the people who might be watching this show, might be also academics or analysts, what do we need to really look out for?
I'll let Glenn go first on that one.
No, I think it's much more dangerous simply because, if you go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, at least the world was in panic. We understood the dangers. There were diplomacy. We're talking about nuclear deterrence. These days, we don't talk about nuclear deterrence. We're talking about nuclear blackmail. Oh, if we launch our missiles into Russian cities, they might use nuclear weapons. Well, we can't bend to nuclear blackmail. So we're going to ignore the whole concept of nuclear deterrence. I mean, this is obscene. And even now with, the Americans sending in troops, the British, threatening to use that their weapons will be used to strike inside Russia. All of these crazy developments happening and Russia responding with possible use of tactical nuclear weapons. Where's the media coverage? It's like, Putin, is just, threatening with nuclear weapons. We have to condemn it. This is very inappropriate. As if it happened in a vacuum. And there's no, as we began to talk about, the absence of strategic empathy.
And it converts into a public diplomacy triumph, making the Russians look like actors again.
Yeah, that's all. The narrative, that's the only thing we seem to be working for. So, no, I think this is much, much more dangerous. But you wouldn't think it if you open any average paper. But it's just,
I'm inclined to agree. Yeah, it's more dangerous because they're getting more desperate. It's more dangerous because there's
the West's getting more.
Yes, the West getting more desperate as Russia's wins the war more and more. It's more dangerous because of domestic political dynamics that are going on in different countries. Obviously, in the United States, you've got the election. It's more dangerous because Western hardliners seem to have an ever more powerful voice in the argument, the debate that's obviously going on in the West about what the West should do. Yes, there's lots of things that kind of like stack up in that direction, and that's certainly been my gut feeling. That's certainly what I feel is more dangerous than it's ever been. But the one thing that perhaps might save us is the West's weakness. Is that they're so weak, I think, in terms of what they can actually do, like militarily in terms of conventional. Yeah, they're in a very and at least some of them on the Western side must know that, and they must know. I just don't believe that there at least aren't some military advisors saying to the politicians or the military leaders, they're saying, look, okay, yeah, we can involve ourselves more in Ukraine, but if you're going to do that, you have to, and you might say, yeah, we can call the Russians bluff, they'll back away, we can do what we want, yeah, this is what we're done. If you're going to do that, fine, be prepared for the contingency of that developing into a much broader conflict with Russia. And the reality is, we are not in a position to engage in a wider war with Russia. So if you're not prepared to meet that contingency, to face that, then don't do it. So I think I'm inclined to say, it's like my gut feeling that in the end, they will draw back from taking extreme steps because of their weakness.
That would be very reasonable and rational. But this is my concern. There doesn't seem to be that much reason. And the problem is we excluded the possibility of diplomacy. We're saying the campaign diplomacy. When Stoltenberg goes out and says, listen, when this war is over, Ukraine will join NATO. Well, if you want any peace agreement, it has to be restoring neutrality of Ukraine has to be the foundation. of course, you have to solve the territorial issues, but this is the foundation, and we now rejected it. And so what will be the peace? We only have victory as a possible outcome. But what happened? We ran out of Ukrainians, and we ran out of ammunition. And the Russians are winning. So the only thing we can do now is reckless escalation, and that's what we're pursuing. Firing missiles into Russia. This is the only possible way we think we can stabilize the situation. And not only is this reckless, but I think the assumption of that Russia will be deterred from retaliating against NATO, I think this is a huge gamble, that Russia would never dare to strike back at Russia. But I think at some point the risk of not striking against Russia, against NATO, would be larger than the risk of doing it, because, just very briefly, this was George Beebe, he's the CIA analyst who used to be a Russian analyst in the CIA. And his main argument was in December 2021 was, if Russia, there's a good chance of them invading now, because if they don't invade now, they never will have the chance, because America's, entrenching itself further and further in Ukraine. So I think we're reaching the same point now. We're saying, okay, let's send a few tanks, something we wouldn't do. We're sending some ammunition. We're sending, F-16s. Now we're saying, we have long-distance missiles. Don't shoot them into Russia. Now, you can't shoot them into Russia. So we're doing more and more. At what point do we have NATO planes, dropping bombs on Moscow and assuming that Russia won't retaliate? I think their restraints has been interpreted as weakness. So I think, the Russians now, the real discussion there is, we don't want a war with NATO, but the failure to deter will only embolden them. So at some point we have to strike them. And I think that's why I'm taking this now, the nuclear threat from Russia, very serious. At least they will hit targets of NATO countries, perhaps not with nuclear weapons, but if they hit them with conventional weapons, some British targets outside Ukraine, for example, and they have the tactical nuclear weapons prepared for as a deterrent. I think we're moving towards that scenario. If not now, it could come later, simply because we're too confident that we can just keep hitting Russia, and they would never dare to take us hit back because we're NATO. I think this logic only goes so far, and we reached that point now.
Well, I preferred how Geoff ended the conversation, but I don't get to choose how it ends, and I just want to thank you both for being here. I think we had a very interesting conversation. I'm glad we did it. Thank you.